you read something like Lord of the Rings and you go, yeah, that's how it is, isn't it? You know, like, even though this is a fantasy, isn't that the way that the universe works?
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Pierpaolo Finaldi. I'm the CEO and publisher of the CTS and your host for this podcast. So I'm very happy to be able to welcome Haley Stewart over from the States. So welcome, Haley. She's an award-winning author, editor of Word on Fire Votive, and host of the Votive podcast. Mum of four, lives in Florida and sometimes leads pilgrimages. And I think you put on one of your blurbs, you always need more bookshelves. So it's going to be a very bookish podcast. She's the author of The Grace of Enough, Jane Austen's Genius Guide to Life, and the Sister Seraphina Mysteries, and was the editor of Women of the Catholic Imagination. But you're really kind of specializing now in children's books. So I wanted to, maybe we can kind of concentrate a bit on that, especially kind of the way that we can use books to pass on the faith. But tell us a bit about your story first. Did you come to kind of Catholicism later in life, or was it something that was always kind of there in the picture?
Yeah, so I'm a convert. I converted when I was about 25. So I grew up in a devout Protestant Christian family. So it was given a beautiful basis in the scriptures and prayer and faith. And then in college encountered the writing of the Church Fathers for the first time. Really, it was my first real dive into church history. And so it was very disorienting because reading things like the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, you're reading about how the very early church thinks about the Eucharist and thinks about obedience to one's bishops, and it all sounded incredibly Catholic, and so it kind of...
Or were you studying kind of theology? Or was
I was studying great texts,
okay, right.
So kind of humanities, and so I kind of didn't know what to do with this new information, so it was kind of simmering there. And then also I was encountering Catholic novels for the first time, so reading Flannery O'Connor and Evelyn Waugh. And so it was like my worldview was shifting. I was trying to put together the pieces of this new information I was receiving, but at the same time, I was being drawn by sacred art and these stories. And so I remember one significant moment, my senior year in college. I was taking a 20th century novel class, and we were reading Brideshead Revisited. And I got to the point in the story where I don't want to spoil it for everyone, but there's a character who's receiving last rites. And it was just something clicked that hadn't clicked before about grace and sin and the power of the sacraments. And I just felt incredibly drawn to receive the sacraments. And so it was an interesting experience that was kind of a moment of grace breaking in through that story, alongside some of the intellectual barriers that were being kind of torn down as I learned more about what Catholicism actually taught.
You may not have noticed at the time, but something I always love to say is in Brideshead Revisited, the CTS is kind of mentioned. And one of the kind of great scenes, the one by the fountain, she talks about you can get the truth for a penny at the back of every church, which is a reference to the Penny Catechism published by the CTS from the 19th century. So I came across your work actually with your blog, Carrots for Michaelmas. Tell us a bit. I mean, a few people may remember that. I think it's basically sort of wound down a bit,
yes,
as many blogs have. But I hope they all kind of stay up somewhere in the ether. I mean, it'll be interesting for historians to look back at them in the future.
I've left the writing up, even though I'm not continuing to add to it. But it was really after my first child was born, that's when I felt the real urgency of, okay, for what I believe now, I believe it's really important to get this baby baptized, but my Baptist tradition that I'm part of at this time doesn't do that. I even asked my Baptist minister, could you just baptize the baby? He was like, we just don't do that, Haley. Like, that's not part of our tradition. And so that's when I signed up for RCIA and was getting much more serious about taking those steps. And then it was a matter of becoming catechized and learning about the faith. And one of the things that really attracted me to the faith was the liturgical year. And so that was just one of the ways that I learned about the faith, kind of following the liturgical year, learning about the different seasons and the different feasts, because there's just so much theology and also just like walking through the life of Christ and the life of the church and the saints. And so as I was converting and working through those things, I kind of wanted to write about it. And so that's how the blog started, is kind of trying to bring the liturgical year into the domestic church, conversion and learning about the faith. And so that's what I started writing about there. And then it went on I wrote on that blog for years and years.
I mean, it's interesting, this question of the liturgical year, because obviously the church has been following this cycle from the beginning, and yet I as a real kind of tool of kind of explicit teaching is become very much kind of in vogue. I mean, there's a lot of work being done with that. I mean, my own wife with a Catholic Mother's Planner does a lot of that, and there's a couple of really good apostolates doing that in the States. Well, Catholic All Year, I'm saying. Yeah. And I always think that, especially we have this kind of real gift that we kind of can give the whole world. The whole world kind of lives its year in a kind of very flat way. It's just basically the weekend and then the rest of the week, and that's how it just goes around this endless kind of circle. Whereas how I mean, was that something that you sort of discovered even, was the liturgical year not so strong kind of in your Baptist background?
Not at all in the Protestant tradition that I grew up in. My parents later became Anglican when I was in college, and so they were kind of diving into that more, but it definitely wasn't part of the tradition I grew up in. And so it was really compelling, this idea that I think it's this intersection between the material and the spiritual and the supernatural, that you could actually be participating in this holy time, not just in your geographic location and your time, but you're kind of participating with the whole church everywhere throughout time, and doing it in this way that's incredibly tangible, which as sensory beings, I think it's really important. We often talk about how the liturgical year is a really effective thing with children because they, need to taste and touch and see. But I think it's true for all of us, So having that, and it's this way of actually participating in the story. Like you get to walk through the story and learn the story more deeply every time it comes around. And so that kind of spiral motion of you're just learning a little bit more every year, and it's
hopefully moving ever closer to the center.
Taking on new significance. And I think that most people would relate to this idea of different Advents might feel different, like you're learning a different lesson, you're noticing a different piece of the story, and maybe there's been a grief, and so it's kind of that dark Advent, and you're experiencing that like O come, Emmanuel kind of feeling. But then other ones are full of just that excitement and anticipation. So it's like you're going through the same story, but you may be experiencing it differently and understanding different parts of it and deepening your participation in the story of Holy Time.
And I think one of the things that has also become it's becoming more and more explicit, I think, is that as human beings, we have this kind of, we've been through this period of kind of extreme kind of rationalism, and that's kind of seeped into Christianity and Catholicism, where it's all about kind of assenting to kind of particular doctrines. But actually what grabs us is the story, really. And the church kind of knows that, and hence the liturgical year as this kind of story that's retold every year. So, I mean, that brings us really to one of the main things that we want to speak about, which is, why is story so important and why does it work so well, especially for children? I mean, why did you kind of start writing kind of children's books in particular?
Well, to be honest about the children's books, it was because the idea came to me in a dream, which is not typically how I receive my writing ideas. But I had a dream about mouse nuns who lived beneath G.K. Chesterton's house. And so I felt like I was legally obligated to write this down. But it's interesting, especially leading up to getting this position at Word on Fire and managing this children's imprint, kind of looking back on life and seeing this convergence of kind of all the things that I'm passionate about kind of coming together into stories for children. So it's just interesting to see Providence at work kind of piecing me together. But I think that both as a mom and as a writer, the idea of participating in the work of sending good stories into the world that are going to help shape a young person's imagination for the gospel. And I think the other piece that I am particularly passionate about, considering kind of the epidemic of despair among young people, is shaping the imagination for hope. And so sending stories into the world that are going to offer an image of that hope and shape the child's imagination to think, okay, I live in a universe that isn't meaningless chaos. It's actually shaped by this movement that ends, that I'm not in a tragedy, I'm in a comedy, and the end of the story is a marriage feast. And so kind of shifting that perspective, because I think it's so much in the air for young people, this sense of everything's crumbling, everything's terrible, there isn't any meaning. And I think that then prevents young people even from doing the things that could be fulfilling, could bring, there's this sense of, well, I don't want to start a family because the world is in such a terrible place. Everything is on this downward trajectory of ultimately defeat and suffering. And so presenting the idea that we have suffering and that's just a reality, but we live inside this universe that's founded on the love of God and which hope exists. And so communicating that first in little ways and then to the young child, but then continuing to kind of shape the child's imagination as they enter young adulthood to retain that sense of hope.
Yeah, because in a sense, maybe encountering, the Gospels just kind of cold can be a little bit difficult, especially with that kind of environment that you've been speaking about. So one of the things that you've spoken about quite a lot is about the fairy tales in particular as a kind of proto-evangelion, kind of a preparation for the gospel. So why don't you maybe take us through, maybe a story in particular and how that works.
So I think I've really deep dived into fairy tales over the past couple of years, which has been delightful because I've always been fascinated by them. But I started reading just a few different books on how they form the young child. So one of those is The Uses of Enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim. One is Vegan Goroyan's Tending the Heart of Virtue, both about fairy tales and children. And there's this sense in both of those, I think they're absolutely correct, that the young child needs the fairy tale in order to both wrestle with the difficult things of life in a safe environment and to practice virtues like courage and to set them to discern what kind of story am I in. I think that's the question that we most need to help young people answer is what kind of story am I in and who am I in the story? And so a fairy tale is a space in which there's challenges, there's grief, there's loss, there's suffering, there's heroes who are living out certain virtues, and there's this sense that things are going to go really wrong, and then unexpectedly, somehow they're going to be set right. And so there's this sense that you're reading the fairy tale wondering, well, how is this going to get sorted out? But there's not this sense of who knows what will happen. Like, it's all this chaos. And so living in kind of Tolkien talks about eucatastrophe, that you have catastrophe, and then the fairy story is a story of eucatastrophe, where there's this breaking in of unexpected grace that flips everything upside down. And so that the final chapter isn't going to be defeat. It's going to be this victory. And so I think that when we're shaped with the sense that that's the universe we live in, that's the universe that God has created and orchestrated for us, and we live within his story, then it's a lot easier to have hope, not simply that like, oh, my life's going to turn out just how I want it to, but something that's more significant is that I'm part of this huge story. And the end of that story is this feast. It's not a tragedy. And so it's this mystery. But I think having that sense of there is an order, and this movement of the story is under the hand of God.
Because I suppose that the phrase that ends all fairy tales, and then they lived happily ever after. I suppose there's been a kind of cynicism towards that. That has sort of eaten away at the very kind of possibility of telling those stories. No?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I see kind of two different sides subverting the fairy tale. So G.K. Chesterton said something to the effect of every fairy tale has the princess, St. George, and the dragon. And it seems to me that we're either taking St. George out of the story or we're taking the dragon out of the story. So there's either this sense of, I don't want to tell my child fairy tales because I don't want my daughter thinking that the Prince Charming is going to come save her. You know, this is not realistic.
Yeah.
So kind of taking St. George out. Or there's this sense that evil isn't really evil. Yeah. So let's remove the dragon.
Just misunderstood.
Let's explain it away, which is, I understand. I think there is a well-intentioned motivation behind that, which is we want to have compassion and see human beings not just as someone who's done something monstrous, but as a person who has wounds, and perhaps we can understand and have compassion for what has happened to them that would lead them here. But I think for a young child, they really need those archetypes. You know, they are interested in the witch, and they're interested in Hansel and Gretel, and they don't need to know why the witch ended up.
Yeah.
Right. They want to know what happens next. Yeah. And that's really how fairy tales are structured, is they explain what's happening. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's not diving into the mind of the characters, which as grown-ups, we get more interested in that. But the young child is really interested in the story and what happens next, which I think is why one of the reasons fairy tales is so attractive to them. But when we are taking the villain of every story and trying to explain away the behavior, I think that in this, I think there's a few problems with that, but one of them would be that often you can't really explain evil. It isn't really rational. Like it doesn't really make sense. And so to try to explain it is almost a practice in insanity. You know, evil isn't that interesting. I think it's Toni Morrison who talks about how evil is actually really boring. And what's interesting is good. Evil's always the same, and you have to dress it up to be interesting. But what's really fascinating is goodness. And so I think in storytelling, that's something that we need to be cautious about. Are we making the good truly compelling, or are we putting all of that into the villain? And so I think that is, in general, a negative development to have.
I mean, it's interesting that, when you read some of the kind of early versions of the Brothers Grimm story, I mean, Grimm is the probably a good word for it. The stories are really terrible. And
there's some gore.
The evil guy is really evil. And
yes, it's some of it's quite disturbing.
Yeah.
It was interesting because we're releasing 30 of Grimm's fairy tales for children. And so to choose which ones to do, I read all of Grimm's fairy tales. There's hundreds and hundreds. And it was fascinating. And some of them I did think, I don't think I'm going to choose this one. But I also didn't want to shy away from anything that was dark, because I think that, and this is something that Bruno Bettelheim talks about in The Uses of Enchantment, is that the young child has fears. And they might be afraid of the dark. They might be afraid of a parent dying. They might have any number of things that they're afraid of. And often their fears are not silly. But as adults, we're uncomfortable with these same fears, so we tend to say, "Oh, that's not going to happen. Don't worry about it," which then doesn't leave them a space to process and think through those things. So something like, "Oh, I'm worried about if mommy or daddy dies." Oh, that's not going to happen. But the child knows, but sometimes that happens to some people, and so having this space where the child can wrestle with some things that are uncomfortable and dark is something that I think most children are actually very attracted to. And if you're telling young children stories of saints, they're really interested in the martyrdoms. Yeah. Well, how were they killed?
Better, yeah.
Exactly. And I think there is this need to face the dragons. The child needs to do that. And the fairy tale gives them a space that's a safe space to face the dragon.
I'd like to speak a little bit about the what's happened to kind of Disney, because I mean, I remember growing up, I loved watching the Disney film, listening to the stories on records. I'm showing my age there, but and I used to think that I used to say, in fact, that after the Catholic Church, one of the greatest forces for good in the world was the Disney, because they, it was made up of really kind of good feelings, positive energies, and great stories that were often told in a very kind of serious way. I mean, watch Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, and I mean those are the witches in those are pretty. I remember in Sleeping Beauty, she says, at one point she says, "Me, the mistress of all evil," and you think that's pretty hard stuff for children. But as time has gone on, and I mean, in particular, I was watching kind of Maleficent. I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast. That it's the Wicked Witch who ends up being like the good one. She's the one who gives the kiss that wakes up Sleeping Beauty, and you just think, as you said, it's kind of removes one of those three elements that Chesterton spoke about. I mean, can you sort of pinpoint a moment? I've got an idea, but can you pinpoint a moment of when that kind of starts to happen? And I think at that point, I think my kids find the newer films kind of quite boring. They're quite kind of flat, and they seem to often be more aimed at adults than children. But
I think so. So I'm trying to think what came before Maleficent, but since then we've had Cruella, we've had just story after story that's based on the villain.
The villain not being the villain, basically.
Right. And in fact, perhaps the hero is actually the bad, in a lot of these, it's, oh, you thought they were so great, but let me also explain away their virtue while I'm explaining away the villain's evil. It's interesting because I think also those are not the films that my children want to go back to. And I think there's still some good things being made by Disney, and I'm trying to think of ones that my children particularly like that are newer. I mean, they love Sleeping Beauty. It's one of my favorites. But Brave, I thought was great. Because so it's Scotland, and it's more about a mother and a daughter, kind of as the daughter is transitioning into young adulthood, them kind of seeing each other in a new way and mending their relationship in a way that I thought was really beautiful. And so my kids love that one. But they've never asked to rewatch Maleficent or Cruella.
Yeah.
It's just never, there is something kind of boring about it, because I think that we are wired for story in a certain way where we're more interested in stories that ring true to us. You know, you read something like Lord of the Rings and you go, yeah, that's how it is, isn't it? You know, like, even though this is a fantasy, isn't that the way that the universe works? You know, is kind of somewhere inside your soul.
I wondered whether it was kind of Shrek that started it, or, you know, because it tried to subvert so many of the kind of tropes, the story tropes.
That's true. The ogre is the good guy.
Yeah. And although it did it very well.
It's very clever.
It's very clever, very funny. The use of music's great. The animation's pretty good as well. But it kind of started this sort of trend that in all the children's, everything had to be subverted, you know, to the point where you get to like Frozen, and, you know, the true love's kiss is, you know, it comes from the sister and not the, you know, it all gets, and I think, you know, the children end up finding it all rather kind of confusing. And the thing that I notice is that they'll watch it once or twice. They'll be kind of amazed by all the colours and the movement, and then they won't want to go back to it. Whereas, you know, the earlier stuff, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've watched with my children, you know, those early Disney stories.
I wonder if it's partly if the child doesn't have the foundation of Sleeping Beauty or, you know, these classic fairy tales, then Shrek isn't interesting because you don't know what it's subverting. Yeah. And so I think as we have this kind of series of subverted stories, that's going to be less and less interesting to the child who hasn't had that sense of the classic stories. It's only interesting in response and conversation with these other ones. And it does just get kind of dull after a while, where it becomes, now this is the trope.
Yeah.
You know, now how are they going to explain away the villain? And I think ultimately those just won't have the same kind of lasting power.
Yeah, which is in a sense I always think is why I'm not kind of so worried sometimes about the kind of the kind of, you know, those books which have really kind of I mean, I'm thinking maybe of say like the Golden Compass series, which are kind of quite subversive, even, you know, especially towards Catholic ideas. But because they're not that great, they just won't stick around.
It's interesting that the story that has captured the imagination the most in the past 20 years is, or longer than that, I suppose, is Harry Potter, which is incredibly Christian in its structure. I mean, it almost hits you over the head with it by the end, where, you know, we're in King's Cross Station after this character has laid down his life, and that's what has turned everything, you know, that's the eucatastrophe that has beaten evil, and that's the story that children gravitated to, which is, I think, speaks to the idea that gospel story is kind of written on our hearts, even maybe perhaps before we've been exposed to it. And so when we see that reflected in a story like Harry Potter, even though, you know, this is witches and wizards, and that something inside of us goes, yeah, that's the true story. I see something true in that story, and that's the one that's going to live in my imagination.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of pearl clutching, I remember at the time, about, you know, whether you can use you know, whether you should give these stories to your kids because of the use of magic. And I mean, I kind of agree that within the Harry Potter stories, magic is kind of, it doesn't have a lot of kind of consequence for the one kind of using it. That's true. There are better versions of that, like, I don't know, like A Wizard of Earthsea or things like that by Ursula Le Guin. But I think overall, as you say, it follows the kind of fairy tale kind of arc, I think.
I think so. I think absolutely. And it's almost a little bit different from some of the other wizard fantasies, because it's almost like a superhero ability. You know, it's not quite that. It's like you have this It's kind of in your DNA that you just have this ability.
He doesn't have to kind of work to get it.
Right. And you're not kind of taking power from something else,
Yeah.
and you're not like a channel for the power
yeah.
in the same way. So, but yes, it was very controversial. I think that the controversy has subsided somewhat once the final book was done. And you could say, see, like this is a very, you have the Christ figure, you have, you can see how it reflects, it's kind of a Christian allegory. And so I think that it's kind of toned everything down a little bit.
So is that really the kind of the way that you see fairy stories as that preparation for the gospel, in that they're telling that, they're essentially always telling that story?
I think so, because I think that they are setting us up within this world where certain things are more powerful than physical power, greed, that you have a story like Cinderella.
Jealousy and all that.
Right. You have a story like Cinderella, and there's this incredible power in her virtue. Like she has this beautiful kindness and charity.
She's almost a saint, I think. In the sense that she makes excuses for others. She sort of doesn't kind of take a vengeance on others, and it sort of accepts all this, and then in the end she's kind of rescued.
Right. And it's kind of, you can see it as this kind of allegory between like Christ and the human soul. And that...
Yeah, expand on that.
Well, that Cinderella she experiences this grace in the Grimm's fairy tale. She gets to go to the ball because she's like kind of praying at her mother's grave. So she goes to her mother's grave and cries, and it's kind of like her mother is interceding for her. And then the other version is the fairy godmother. But there's always this kind of grace that's breaking in to meet this person, and then the prince is pursuing her and kind of pulling her out of this situation that she's in. And so it's this grace, and kind of her virtue is what opens her up to these interactions, and she's able to receive that grace. And I do like the image of kind of the hound of heaven, that the prince he's not going to stop looking for her. Yeah. He's going to find her, like the lost sheep. And so I think that those sorts of connections are just like, fairy tales are just filled with them. And Grimm's fairy tales are interesting to me because I didn't realize how religious they are. And they're kind of, they might be ancient stories that are from pagan times, and yet you read them and you're like, wow, it's so fascinating to see like these little glimmers of the gospel in them. And then the Grimms really, I think, drew out those Christian or perhaps pre-Christian elements that then they saw in the stories. So that's kind of interesting because I just didn't expect that so much.
Well, I suppose it's the fact that these are kind of written down, kind of edited, I suppose, in such a kind of Christian context that you kind of they couldn't help it really in a
right
sense.
Kind of like we read Beowulf now, and there's all these Christian elements, but perhaps they weren't initially there, but as the story is told, it's understood within this Christian worldview and kind of is shaped by that.
So what's been kind of the favorite story that you've used, that you've told to your children, or that you yourself heard growing up?
Oh, probably Beauty and the Beast.
Right, okay.
So that one's not a Grimm's, but I didn't realize, I loved it as a child, and I didn't realize until later that it's kind of a retelling of Cupid and Psyche. And then that, also there's all these glimmers of the gospel in that. Have you read Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis? Like, he draws all that out so incredibly. But I loved Beauty and the Beast. And then there's another story that I included in as one of the selected stories from Grimm's that we had a picture book of, called The Bear Skinner. or Bearskin, maybe it's called. And it's about a soldier. The war is over, so he can't make any money, and he's kind of starving. And so the devil shows up to make a deal with him and says, I'll make sure you have as much money as you need, but you can't pray for the next 7 years. And you have to wear this bear skin that's going to make you look kind of like this wild man, knowing that this is going to isolate the man. And if you take it off, then I get your soul. But if in 7 years you've done all this, then you'll have as much money as you want. And so he agrees to this deal and is just miserable because he looks like a monster, and he's so lonely, and he starts paying poor people to pray for him and intercede for him because he's not allowed to pray for himself. But finally he wins the battle, and he marries this lovely young woman, and so it's really interesting because it's this kind of disturbing story of extreme isolation and misery and disconnection from God and other people, and seeing like that's kind of where the devil has a lot of power over us, in that isolation. And when we're separated from God and can't even pray, but then he does have this kind of grace through this woman who agrees to marry him even when he's covered in the bear skin, and that kind of moves him through to the 7 years when he is freed. And so I'm just fascinated by that story, and it's one I think about a lot, in just suffering, and even thinking about things like mental illness, how those can make us isolated from other people, or that's when we need that connection to God and other human beings. And so it's not what I think of as a typical fairy tale, but I found it to be really powerful.
It's interesting that we've been talking about these stories, but in lots of different kind of media. That we read them, we watch films of them, there's comic versions, illustrated versions. I mean, how do you see those kind of relating to each other, and what do you think is kind of the best form?
Well, I don't know if there's a best form, but it seems to me that because these started as oral traditions, that I do love the idea of parents telling the stories to children, whether reading them aloud or just so that the child's imagination can put the pictures together before they're given images of it, perhaps. But I also think there is a lot of value to good films. Like, I think back on the Disney Beauty and the Beast, and I think that's a really fantastic film. That it's beautiful. Or Sleeping Beauty. The animation in Sleeping Beauty is just beyond. I mean, it's so beautiful.
It's very stylized,
all the gothic
yeah.
elements. It's so detailed, and you just sit there, and it's kind of a quiet film. Yeah. It was the film I would watch with my youngest, because she went through this stage of waking up at 4 a.m. every morning for like 3 months. And so I'd get up with her, and I'd have my coffee, and I'd turn on Sleeping Beauty, because it was just very beautifable, very calming.
That kind of green light when she's sort of following her, always kind of disturbed me slightly. On the other hand, I was one of my older brothers, who was always a huge Tolkien fan. He up to this day has managed not to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because he said, no, I have like a picture of what Middle Earth looks like, what Aragorn looks like in my head, and I don't want that to change. Which I always thought was a very kind of brave decision. Although I think they did that very well. But I thought it was real kind of commitment to those imaginative kind of pictures that come into our head.
And there's really nothing more distressing than watching a film and thinking, no, that's not what they look like, or no, that's not how it's supposed to be. I sometimes get very riled up about Jane Austen adaptations, where I'm like, no, wrong.
Yeah. So maybe we can move on to that, because you've written your own sort of reflection on the Jane Austen stories, and they are, I mean, they're often kind of seen as quite kind of frivolous in a way. They deal with very kind of superficial things in a sense. And yet, so what have you kind of seen kind of deeper there?
Yeah. I've always loved the stories, but I really got to dive into them more deeply in college. I did a reading course just with a philosophy professor, and we read all of the novels and then talked about them kind of through the lens of moral philosophy. And and then discovering that, like Alistair MacIntyre and After Virtue, he talks about Austen as kind of this moral philosopher and this convergence of the Aristotelian worldview and the Christian worldview, and you can kind of see this demonstrated in the novels. And so that just really fascinated me because I think that she is so observant of human nature, and she uses these settings that are tiny. So I always think of like her worlds in the novels as being like inside a snow globe. You know, they're like so small. There's just a handful of characters usually
they
in
keep
this
meeting each other, and they go to the same balls. And
right.
Yeah.
And yet within that really small world, she's able to tackle some of these big questions about what is a good person? How does a good person act? How does someone become good who's not good at the beginning? How do our relationships with other people contribute to that development of virtue? And I think that over time, I've just appreciated it more and more because most of us are not going to be making those moral decisions on a battlefield or in a throne room, you know. So there's like a lot of novels that are set in these really dramatic settings, which most of us are never going to experience, but we're all going to experience that moment at a party where you're kind of stuck talking to the irritating person, and you would really have more fun talking to someone else, but you're trying to decide, should I sit and talk to this person because that's really the kind thing to do, and or should I go talk to this more interesting person and kind of snub? That's a situation where we've all been in. And so seeing that those kinds of decisions play out in the story and then the consequences from them, I think gives all of us more of a sense of those are the little decisions that form our character and have actually pretty big consequences. Because in Jane Austen, often it's not some huge sin that is the problem. It's more of a minor thing. Like Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, he just doesn't want to be bothered with the things he really should be doing to manage the family and the estate. And that causes so much suffering. But he's not a monster. And we kind of like him.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's what's so
as a
fascinating.
father of 5 daughters, I always can relate to him very much.
Wanting to go into the study and
closing
just
himself
read
up
a
in
book.
the library. Yeah. No, and you're right in the sense it's not, you know, war and peace taking place on the kind of backdrop of, you know, continent-wide wars, but it's the simple but nonetheless very serious kind of problems of, you know, who are you going to marry? Who are you going to, you know, are you going to survive in a world which, you know, is quite kind of difficult? And are you going to have true friendships and things like that?
Yes, and I think that another thing she does so well is show how our community can help or hurt us in our quest for virtue. And a lot of times her characters have this moment, C.S. Lewis calls it their moment of undeception,
right?
Where they kind of wake up and realize that they haven't seen things clearly and that they're in the wrong.
Yeah.
And we all really need other people to be mirrors to help us see ourselves well, because without friendship and without community, without relationships within the family, it's hard to grow in virtue. You know, we need that element to be able to become self-aware and make any progress, you know, in the moral and spiritual life.
Yeah. I mean, you've also edited a book called Women of the Catholic Imagination. I'm kind of interested first of all, we'll come back to the kind of women part of it, but what do you mean by kind of Catholic imagination? Because I think it's that's a very important kind of. I mean, especially here in the UK, which was, I suppose, well, I don't know. We talk of Chesterton and then of Belloc and all those writers, Green and War, and those writers of the Catholic literary revival. Is it that area that you're talking? I mean, you have a few in America as well, but since we're here, let's talk about those ones.
So it's a difficult question because it's kind of controversial. Some people don't even like that phrase Catholic imagination. But when I think about the Catholic imagination, I'm thinking about art that's kind of formed by the faith in some way, and that has these elements of sin and grace and sacramental worldview. So that's still a little bit vague. I know some people just have lots of opinions on what constitutes the Catholic imagination, but that'll just be kind of my vague answer there. But as I was trying to determine who to include in the volume, I decided let's do only baptized Catholics. So someone like Willa Cather would be a good candidate, but she's not actually a Catholic, although she has so much sacramental worldview in her stories. And so that would be one element, and then a writer who's formed by the sacramental imagination in some way. So baptized Catholic who's formed by the sacramental imagination, which comes out in their stories in some way. So those were kind of the two elements that needed to be in place when we were choosing different writers to dive into. But my vision for that book was just, how can we bring some of these women writers into the conversation that have either been forgotten over time, or their Catholic identity isn't something that's really noted, like Toni Morrison or Donna Tartt, very, very popular writers, but not a lot of people go, I didn't know they were Catholic. So just bringing that into the conversation, because I think often we think of, well, the Catholic novel, that's Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Tolkien, and then usually Flannery O'Connor, gets in there as well. But that there's just such a wealth of novelists, and kind of just highlighting them, hoping that people will dive into their novels.
No, and a few of them are being brought back into print, and we're going to be publishing something about those as well, because they often the stories that they tell are also very kind of bit like in Jane Austen, maybe take place in a kind of parish context or something very kind of domestic, but at the same time grappling with huge kind of questions that can be quite helpful.
Yeah, there's such a range, right? Because Flannery O'Connor, her stories are mostly not domestic.
Yes.
They're very intense. And then you have other writers, like even Sigrid Undset, her stories are dramatic, but it's very domestic. It's taking place in this world in a way that is rarely seen in literature to that degree, where just the character's motherhood and experiences.
I haven't managed to. I've started them 2 or 3 times, and I just can't get past the sort of.
You should try the audiobook. I've had people who've had really good success with that because they got bogged down. But really, I think Kristin Lavransdatter is the most complex, interesting female character in literature. I can't think of anyone who could rival her. It's just incredible. But I think it is fascinating to read a story kind of centered on a mother's experience. It's really fascinating, because often mothers in stories are kind of that's when they kind of fade out of the story, and it's now the children that are interesting. Yeah. And so kind of following this woman from basically birth to death, where she's still the main character as she's going through pregnancy after pregnancy and experiencing these different phases of motherhood and growing older, that's just not something we see a lot. And so even though it seems like a simple thing, it's really compelling in a novel.
Well, so it's been a fascinating discussion. What? Tell us what you're kind of working on. What are the next projects that are kind of coming through from your the children's imprint in particular, and anything else you're working on?
Yeah, so we have a few really exciting things coming up. One of them is a children's Bible called The Story of All Stories, and Emily Stimson Chapman wrote the stories for us. It's 75 stories from Old and New Testament, kind of telling the story of salvation. And another project coming out is called Past Watchful Dragons, and it's biblical stories retold as fairy tales. And so it's kind of taking this setting of this fairy tale world, and you dive into a story, and then you realize partway through, oh, this is Adam and Eve, or this is Ruth and Naomi. And so it's really fun to experience kind of scripture without the veil of familiarity, as C.S. Lewis calls it, where we get kind of so used to it, it doesn't have the same power anymore. So it just allowing you to see it with fresh eyes, which I think will be really fun for the young reader to kind of dive in and then realize, oh, I know what story this is.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for coming to speak with us, and we look forward to seeing those books in the near future.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.